everyone. I hope all of you are doing well. Welcome once again to the fifth and final day of the winter school. I must say it's really a pleasure to see so many of you joining us today and for those who have been with us throughout these days. So now, as you see, this is fifth and the final day of the winter school, and thankfully for us, this day is not over yet. So like yesterday and each day, we have another set of interesting sessions lined up for you. And for today, we begin with Professor Shivaprakash, much awaited lecture on Bhakti and Siddha traditions. So for this session, I would like to invite my senior colleague and very dear friend, Dr. Praveen Shetty. Dr. Praveen Shetty is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Management, Manipal Institute of Technology, Manipal. He teaches communication skills in English and intercultural studies at MIT, Manipal. He also teaches select modules at Manipal Center for European Studies on topics related to European identity, theories of culture and literature, and he's a recipient of Jean Monnet module, Building Bridges, Indo-European Intercultural Dynamics. Professor Shetty, welcome and please take the event forward.
Thank you, Tanima, for the kind words. Very good morning to all. Very good morning to Professor Shivaprakash. Now, to introduce a personality to whom the audience require no introduction is a paradox in itself. We all know the details of Professor Shivaprakash, his academic credentials and his works. Yet, the formality of the occasion demands that I attempt obvious. So, with all respect, let me introduce Professor Shivaprakash, an acclaimed poet, playwright, translator, was professor at School of Arts and Aesthetics in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He's among the most prominent literary figures in the contemporary India, as we already aware of. Recognized as a fresh voice in Kannada literature at a very young age, has emerged as a definitive voice in the Indian literary space today. He's a renowned scholarly authority on Kannada Vachana, Sufism, Indian Bhakti traditions, and mystic symbolism. His celebrated work as a playwright, Mahacharitra, led to Professor Shivaprakash winning the Kannada Sahitya Academy Award initially, and subsequently he received the Fellowship for Literature from Human Resource Ministry in 1997 and Sahitya Academy New Delhi Award in 2013. He was also the editor of Indian Literature, Sahitya Academy Journal from 1997 to 2001, and director of Culture at Embassy of India, Berlin, from 2012 to 2014. He is also a recipient of Karnataka Nataka Academy Award and Sangeet Nataka Academy Award. Professor Shivaprakash is also an honorary fellow at the School of Letters at the University of Iowa. His lecture today, interestingly titled Art, Labor and Ethics in Bhakti Siddha Tradition, focuses on how Kannada Vachana poetry of Bhakti and Siddha tradition impacted cultural and artistic expressions beyond space and time. It would deliberate on how, in the inbuilt poetics of artisan poets of the 12th century Sharana tradition in Karnataka, labor and ethics and expression in words, that is, Kayaka, Nade, and Nudi, are interrelated. We're all looking forward to your views, Professor. So, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Shetty, for your generous words of introduction. And I was to make a presentation the first day because of my ill health. I wasn't very good at it because I'm feeling much better today. I hope to do better. The title of my presentation is Bhakti, how I would like to rephrase it a little bit. It is the poetry, poetics, praxis, and philosophy of Kayaka in the poetry of Sharanas in the 12th centuries. I will rephrase the title, which is not very much of a departure from the one I had suggested when I was asked to speak on this topic. Because when we talk about Bhakti traditions, the existing scholarship is very vague and very selective. The word Bhakti itself is not very adequate or appropriate. We use the word Bhakti to refer to a series of the developments in arts and aesthetics in India, which dates back to 6th century of the Common Era, and which lasted up to the inception of colonialism. There were a series of cultural renaissances, if I could call them that, in different parts of India. And Professor Madhav in his presentation talked about the whole, laid before us the historical map of Bhakti tradition, starting from Tamil Nadu at that century, in about the 6th or 7th century, right up to 18th and 19th century. There was a series of such, spiritual and aesthetic awakenings in different parts of India during this period. We cannot postulate a linear relationship between them, but they were learned from each other and they developed on their own, I think. So we use the word Bhakti to refer to this rich outburst of not just literary text, but also music, drama, dance, and sculpture and visual arts all over India for well over a millennium. Now, Madhav contested the use of the word Bhakti because obviously because the so-called Bhaktas themselves don't call themselves Bhaktas. For example, if you look at the Tamil Bhakti texts of 6th and 7th century of both Shaivite and Vaishnavite variety, Nayanmar and Alvas, they call themselves Tondas. Tondas means slaves, Adiyar, men of the feet of the Lord. So later, the word Bhakti was used of them later, when the oral texts were compiled, nearly 4 or 5 centuries after the inception of Tamil Bhakti tradition in Tamil Nadu. Only later it was called Bhakti Ilakyam, Bhakti Literature. Now, if you look at the Sharana tradition of 12th century, I want to dwell on the word Sharana, because many people, including Devan, and used the word Virashaiva Bhakti to talk about the 12th century literary efflorescence in Karnataka. But if you look at the philosophy of what is believed to be Virashaivism, and of late, all of us know that there was a big debate in Karnataka about whether this tradition should be called Virashaiva Lingayat. It was a big political controversy. I'm not interested in politics because both the word Virashaiva and Lingayata occur very rarely in the Vachana text. And the word that Vachanakaras in the 12th century use of themselves is Sharana. Sharana is the word which they appellatively use, apply to themselves, not Virashaiva or Lingayata. Lingayata refers to the wearing of the linga. Which, of course, it is believed that the 12th century Sharanas worshipped Shiva in the form of Shivalingam worn on the body. And so they were Lingayatas. But according to me, not all Vachana poets seem to have believed or practiced this Linga worship. Though I'll tell you why this misunderstanding came about later. And Veerashaiva is the name of a sect. It's sect specific, and Lingayat is practice specific. But Sharana is attitude specific. The word Sharana dovetails with other words which are used by in other Bhakti traditions in India, like Dasa, the slave, which in Tamil was called Adiyar. Even Alvar means somebody who has drowned in the devotion of the deity, and Dasa in some places, and Sharana, and this kind of surrender to the divine, which has different synonyms, describe with different synonyms in India. So it's like to call it Sharana poetry, and the expression of Sharanas was the Vachanas of the 12th century. Now, if you look at the philosophy of Sharanas, which was formulated nearly 200 years after the efflorescence of Vachana writing, during the age of the consolidation of Vachanas in the empire of Vijayanagara Empire under the rule of Prodhadevaraya. It was at this point of time that the familiar narratives and mythologies about the Sharana culture was developed. This was the age when these texts, which were in oral tradition, were put into writing. They were compiled, analyzed, and commented upon, and a systematic philosophy called Shakti Visishta Advaita philosophy was developed on the basis of this. But all these were later developments, and they do not correspond to what is the contents of the Vachanas themselves, which were written around the 12th century. And there were two kinds of compilation of Vachanas. One is the collections of Vachanas, like Shiva Yoga Pradipika and several others. And there was a dramatic anthology of these Vachanas called Shunya Sampadane. There were 4 versions of it. The first one was compiled by Shivagana Prasad Mahadevaya in around 15th century, 14th or 15th century. There were later the 3 more versions of it. And these are very creative anthologies, very great creative anthologies of poetry. Very few of this kind exist in the world. Another creative anthology of spiritual poetry is Guru Granth Sahib, which is the scripture of Sikh religion, which is one of the Nirguna Bhakti traditions of North India. I'm not going into that now. So that's why I use the word Sharana, and they express themselves in the form of Vachana. And what is this Vachana? Scholars have discussed whether Vachanas are of Kannada origin or they derive from Sanskrit influence. Late Professor Chinadmurti argued that Vachanas are entirely of Kannada origin. Professor Kalburgi also stood by this view, whereas Professor L. Basavaraj, another great Vachana scholar, disagreed with them. He says that Vachanas are the extensions of the prose spiritual expressions in Sanskrit, the kind one finds in the Upanishads and in the Brahmanas, etc. So it has its precedent in Sanskrit. But whether the Bhakti expressions had the precedence in Sanskrit or not is something that we have to look at a little closely, because if you look at different literary expressions forged by Bhakti traditions in different parts of India, we have different nomenclatures. For example, in Maharashtra, it was called Ovi and Abhanga. Ovi stood for a meter, and Abhanga is another meter. In Marathi, they say Ovyancha Gnanoba and Abhangancha Tuka. Gnaneshwar excelled in Ovi and Tukaram in Abhanga. And in North Indian languages, sometimes it's called Vani. For example, Goraka Vani. And then there is another, Vachan is also, Kabir Vachan. Hazari Prasad Vivedi edited for the first time Kabir's poems as Kabir Vachan. Another word is Vak, Lalla Vak. So this Vachana, Vak, and Vani, which means saying, this is the pan-Indian genre of Bhakti imagination. So Vachana is a version of the pan-Indian Bhakti expression, which has all these called by all these synonyms. Now the point here is, how is this Vachana or Vani, the new creative expression forged by Bhakti traditions, different from literary expressions of the period that preceded it? I would like to call it a shift from indirect speech to direct speech. A lot of classical poetry which preceded the Bhakti expressions in different Indian languages is narrative. It is narrating what happened to others, the deeds of great heroes, military heroes, and so on. But Bhakti is a tradition where one is not narrating something, but one is having a dialogue with the divine. It's a more dialogic kind of literary expression. So Vachana is one of them. Now, I said the word Bhakti is inadequate because if you look at the evolution of Bhakti in different parts of India, this was coeval with the evolution of the Siddha traditions. For example, Tamil Shaivism has two origins, and the Bhakti component of Tamil tradition, Shaiva tradition, is represented by Tirumurais, the songs and sayings of Tamil Shaivite saints called Nayanmas. And there's a parallel tradition of Siddhas, which goes to Tirumula. So Tirumandiram is a text which is the source of this Siddha tradition. And there was a series of great Siddhas in this tradition in Tamil Nadu. Gorakkar and Bogar and even Agastya belong to this lineage. So these are two parallel traditions. And though they're interrelated, they are distinctly different from each other. Now, what is Bhakti? Before I explicate the word Bhakti, let me describe to you what I mean by the Siddha tradition. Siddha tradition employs different techniques of self-purification to attain the divine. Here, the divine is a principle, vital principle within one's own body and one's own consciousness. And how is this attained? Through several means of purification, purification of the breath, purification of the body, purification of the mind, through different kinds of meditation, etc. So Shiva here is an abstract entity. Shiva is a principle of consciousness. In the Tamil tradition, Shiva is also identified with the breath. There is a yoga which is associated with that tradition called Vasi Yoga. What is the meaning of Vasi? Vasi is the breath. But they say if you invert the word Vasi, it becomes Shiva in Tamil. So Shiva is a vital principle or principle of consciousness in human body. How to attain that is what is described in the Siddha path. Whereas Bhakti is an approach of based on feelings. It is the unadulterated, unconditional love for some form of the divine. So it is the word that is often used by Bhakta is called Bhavana. Akama Devi was one of the greatest Bhakti poets in Kannada. She says, Bhavana yanagidu jivanavanoda. So this feeling itself, feeling is my life breath. So feeling of Bhakti towards the divine. And These days, a lot of people, particularly export quality gurus, mix up everything and they talk about bhakti yoga. Bhakti is also yoga and so on. But if you look at the origins of bhakti, bhakti is not yoga. Bhakti is the critique of yoga. And many of the bhaktas were themselves aware of it. Basavanna, in one of his vachanas, says, Nada Priyanam Barushivana, Nada Priyanalla, Veda Priyanam Barushivana, Veda Priyanalla, Nada Priyano Allah, Veda Priyano Allah, Bhakti Priyanama Kudosanamade. What does it mean? It means that some people say Shiva is pleased by Nada. Nada means the agamic tradition. Which is one form of piety that existed in India in those days. The other is Veda, the path of sacrifices and Vedic rituals and so on. Some people say Shiva is pleased by Vedic rituals. It says neither is true. Shiva is Bhakti Priya. So Bhakti is developed in Bhakti traditions as a critique of both the Vedic and Agamic traditions. I'm not saying that Bhakti was anti-Vedic, anti-Agamic or anything. It was distinct and different from these traditions. It was the path of pure feelings. And the expression of Bhakti is by nature, it's leads to expression through arts, creative arts like poetry, dance, music, and so on. And there have been some attempts in Indian tradition to connect Bhakti tradition with rasa of Sanskrit poetics. Last time, I think Professor Madhav talked about how the theologians of Gaudiya Vaishnavism tried to combine Bhakti aesthetics with rasa aesthetics. But more important than that, there's another important text of 10th century Kashmir, which develops the theory of Bhakti Rasa very consistently. This text is called Shivastotravali by Utpala Deva, who belongs to the Acharya Parampara of the great Shaivite philosopher and aesthetician Abhinav Gupta. And it's an enchanting expression of Bhakti poetry, though many scholars says that Bhakti is anti-Sanskrit. This I don't subscribe to this view, because in Sanskrit also there are magnificent works of Bhakti, intense Bhakti poetry. One example is Shivastotravali Utpala Deva, and another Tamil, Sanskrit text which was composed by the Tamil Alvar poet Kulashekara Alvar, Mukundamala, and later, of course, Gita Govindam, Jayadeva, another great classic of Bhakti literature in India, Bhakti poetry in India. So Utpala Deva's Shivastotravali is an exposition of Shaiva Bhakti Rasa. And I quote, because this text has hardly been discussed by Bhakti scholars anywhere. I would like to quote a few stanzas and to explain how Utpala Deva understands Bhakti. And Utpala Deva clearly says in the 18th verse of the first section of Shivastotravali, Na yogo, na tapo, na chakrama, kopi praniyate, amaye shivamarge, bhaktireva prashastyate. It says in the path of Shiva, there is no place for yoga, or tapa, or asceticism, archana krama, different forms of worship, because all forms of worship are external. And in Shiva Marga, in the path of Shiva, that Bhakti that is talking about, Bhaktireva Prashastyate. Only Bhakti is of supreme importance. And Bhakti is identified with spontaneous joy. And Utpala Deva is neither for or against the Vedic Agamic traditions. Vedagama Viruddhaya, Vedagama Vidayine, Vedagama Sapatvaya Guhyaya Swamini Namaha, Sachaktaya Guhyaya Swamini Namaha. Shiva is neither against the Vedas or Agamas, nor for them. He is combination of them, but he's both. He's beyond both. So Bhakti is independent of spiritual tradition, independent of the Vedic tradition, and it's the path of incessant joy. And he says once very clearly, he says, Shiva Shiveti Namani Tava Niravadi Japyamanesmin Aswadayan Bhaveyam Kimapi Maharasa Mapunuruktaha. He says, by chanting the name Shiva Shiva non-stop, I am tasting the Maharasa of Bhakti. So Bhakti is compared to a kind of Maharasa. So Bhakti is equated with Rasa. And if you look at various expressions of Bhakti in whichever language of India, we find this the element of ecstasy in them. To illustrate this, I quote one Vachana, famous Vachana by Basavanna. Vachanadalli Namamruta Tumbi, Nayanaದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಮೂರುತಿ ತುಂಬಿ, ಕಿವಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕೀರುತಿ ತುಂಬಿ, ಮನದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ನೆನಪು ತುಂಬಿ, ಕೂಡಲ ಸಂಗಮ ದೇವ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಚರಣ ಕಮಲದೊಳಗಾನು ತುಂಬಿ. My words, Vachanadalli Namamruta Tumbi, are filled with the nectar of your name. My eyes are filled with your beauteous form, and my ears are filled with your praises. My heart is full of your remembrance. Oh, Kudala Sangamadeva, I am a bee in your feet. Tumbi also means the filling up, it also means the bee. Nimma Kudalas Nimma Charana Kamadavano to be in the lotus, in your lotus feet. I'm inside your lotus feet is filled up with me. It also means I am the bee in your lotus feet. So, like the bee is absorbed in the nectar, Bhakta is absorbed in the divine. So, this leads to the experience of what Utpalacharya calls Bhakti Rasa. So, Bhakti is basically a supreme form of rasa. Now, the Sharana poetry, Vachanas by Sharanas are not all about Bhakti. Even in the philosophy developed on the basis of the Vachanas called Shastra Siddhanta, 2 centuries after the Vachanas were composed, Bhakti is one of the phases of the sixth phase evolution of a Sharana. It's the third stage, Bhakti Sthala. It's only one of the stages. Like in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, Bhakti is only one of the components of yoga practice, Ishvara Pranidhana. Here also Bhakti has a place, but it's not the entire thing. And what are the other Vachanas about? There are 3 kinds of Vachana expressions according to me, when we try to generalize on the basis of thousands of Vachanas that we have discovered, and most of which have been published, though some more are yet being discovered. Nearly 2.5 lakh and odd Vachanas have been published by now by more than 100 Vachana poets. If you look at all of them, and there are 3 broad types of expression Vachanas. One is Bhakti. I've already given an example of that. The other is the negation, a critique of Bhakti. For example, those who represent the Siddha tradition, like Allama and Siddharama and others, their approach is totally different. Allama openly critiques, comes down hard on Bhakti whenever the occasion arises. Somewhere he says, Hoyittalla Bhakti Jalavapuri. Oh, Bhakti was washed away by the flowing water. And elsewhere he says, for example, many Virishaiva Bhaktas believe that if you wear a Shivalingam on the body, Baswan also believe that this, you become a Bhakta. Allama Prabhu says in one of his vachanas, if you put a stone on a bamboo plant, is that stone a linga, and is that bamboo plant a Bhakta? And the Guru who gave such a linga, and the Bhakta who accepted such a linga, let Mari, the goddess of destruction, enter their houses, and let Gogeshwara linga, the Lord Gogeshwara, go somewhere else. So time and again he comes very hard on Bhakti, because for him Bhakti is a very superficial approach. His approach is one of self-purification and self-transformation through the practice of yoga and tantra. Though Allama Prabhu is also critical of the existing techniques of yoga and tantra, I'm not going into this. Suffice it to say, there's one dominant expression, which is the expression of Bhakti, inspired Bhakti. The other, which is inspired by this Siddha philosophy of self-purification, as is expressed in the Vachanas of Allama Prabhu and Kannada Vachana, Siddharama, and others. Now, there's another important expression of Bhakti in Sharana poetry, in Vachanas, which is unique to Bhakti traditions, the like of which I have not come across anywhere else in Indian Bhakti tradition to the best of my knowledge. This is the philosophy of Kayaka. It is everybody's knowledge that the Vachanakaras, the Vachana poets, the 12th century, the majority of Sharanas came from the laboring classes. They can be called artisans, but not all of them artisans, because artisans are those who make the products, their own implements of labor, like the goldsmith, the cobbler, and so on. But there were also others like the cowherds, there were farmers, there were the doctors, the town criers, and the prostitutes, and so on and so forth. So quite a huge number of artisan and laboring Vachanakaras, and they have their own version of spiritual transformation, which is different from that of Bhakti and that of the Siddha type of expression. And what is it? A lot of bhaktas, people who became bhaktas, they had to abandon their homes and hearths, and they had to abandon their, to become monks or go in search of God. They became mendicants and they abandoned their trade and profession. But here is a group of Vachana poets who consider the practice of the kayaka, their labor. I can't call it manual labor, because the word kayaka means the labor done, performed with the whole of the body, the entire body. And in the Sharana philosophy, the word kaya is not just physical body, it has other components, subtle body, etc., sukshma, sthula, the 5 sheets of human body, which is talked about in the Indian spiritual tradition. So labor which is performed with all this, all one's resources at all levels of one's existence. So this is the poetry and philosophy of poetics and philosophy of Kayaka, and I'm going to give you several examples to illustrate this, and then I'll sum up my arguments again. Now, though many people invoke the term, the phrase Kayakave Kailasa, while talking about Sharana tradition, Vachanas, and most of them are mistaken because they think that this is from a poem by Vachana by Basavanna. It's not from Basavanna. It's by Aidaki Maraya, another Vachanakara of the artisan variety. And so Kaya Kaive Kailasa means labor is liberation. It's very difficult to translate. And most people have translated as work as worship. And Reverend Channappa Uttangi, who first wrote in English about Vachanakaras, he identified this work is worship principle with this Protestant ethics, because he read Vachana tradition as a kind of Hindu Protestant movement, and later this kind of reading was continued by scholars like Rama Rama. I'm not going into that. So, Kaya Kave Kailasa, this is the motto of this Kayaka-based Vachana poets. And there were cobblers, as I told you, there were washermen, there were barbers, and there were shoemakers, and town criers, and cowherds, and so on. And I am going to read out the translations of some of these vachanas by laboring vachanakaras, and to illustrate how they are expressing a philosophy and poetry and poetics distinct and different from those of the other great contemporaries. And in fact, the Adya Vachanakara, the first Vachanakara in the Vachana tradition, is supposed to be Chennaya the cobbler. So it's remarkable that the Vachana tradition, the pioneer of Vachana tradition, is a Dalit Madhari Chennaya the cobbler. And this brings to me to another important point about the Vachanas. The scholars have argued whether Bhakti traditions in general and the Vachana in particular have they been for or against caste system. And some scholars who have worked on Tamil Bhakti tradition, Professor Madhav Devadevan quoted them, M.G. Narayanan and the Keshav. They consider Tamil Bhakti a state-sponsored project, which did in no way try to relax the hold of caste in exploitative caste system in society. Some people say, like Chidanmurti and Mishwaran, who are great Vachana scholars, who talk about Bhakti as a kind of liberation from caste and class restrictions. So many people have even argued that Bhakti is a kind of anti-Brahminical and anti-upper caste movement. It was an exercise in the dissolution of caste. Once upon a time, I believed in this goody-goody theory. I don't subscribe to it anymore. Neither will I say that Bhakti supported and strengthened the caste system, nor will I say, like some types of newfangled scholarship, which argues that Vachanakaras or Bhaktas never bothered about caste system at all. They were only spiritual beings and expressing some spiritual truths. What I see in Bhakti tradition is that they do talk about caste, but caste is not, they talk about caste not to eliminate caste. It's not an anti-caste movement of any kind. They talk about the caste not with any kind of inferiority complex. For example, we look at the composition of cobbler poets like Madhara Chennaya and Madhara Duraya. There's no inferiority complex in the expression. Neither is there superiority complex. It's a matter of fact thing for them. They consider the labor that they perform, the different stages of the process of labor, as a spiritual practice. This is the most important thing. So they assert their caste without trying to feel bad about it or without boasting about it. It's a matter of fact thing for them. So looking at these examples, what can I say is that Bhakti was neither far against caste, but it created an atmosphere where people from different caste groups could enjoy a certain amount of social equality in the different platforms which were established by different Bhakti schools of India. And Bhakti again is whether it's part of Hinduism or not is a different question. I'm not going into that. But all these Bhakti Margas and Siddha, Bhakti and Siddha traditions, also the tradition of these Kayika-centered poets, they belong to what can be called Guru Parampara of Indian tradition as opposed to Acharya Parampara. Guru Parampara is based on Diksha, the initiation of the disciple by the Guru. So anybody can be initiated into in Guru Parampara, irrespective of the caste, whereas this is not the case in Acharya Parampara. When we talk about the gradual institutionalization of different radical Bhakti traditions in India, people have given different appellations like Brahminization, institutionalization, Hinduization, etc., etc. Now, what has happened, the exact process here is Guru Parampara is being transformed into Acharya Parampara, where caste becomes important. For example, the Vachana lore belong to Sharanas, who belong to Guru Paramparas, but now this is become the monopoly of Lingayat or Shiva tradition, which is supported by big monastic institutions, and this belongs to Acharya Parampara. In that particular monastery of Lingayat Shivas, after one Matadipati head abdicates, he brings in another successor who is from the same caste or subcaste. So this is the relationship between caste and Bhakti traditions. Now let me cut out everything else and let me give you some examples. I think I'm already running out of time. I just have time for 2-3 examples of such artisan vachanas. Chennaya the cobbler, the first Vachanakara, one of his vachanas, he says, after erecting 3 pillars, the gross, the subtle, and the causal bodies, after beating the buffalo's rough hide, after removing the flesh with the staff of the manifest and the hidden, after tanning the hide with the fiber of dualism, after pouring the caustic juice of quintessence into the hide pouch of awareness, the blemishes of soul thus destroyed, I have come to take the sandals to his feet. Take care, not of the ground below, but of the path your feet and sandals take. Do not be enslaved by the hand-awl, blade, or peg, but realize Rama Rama, your own true self, joy. So this is Madharachani. So here is describing different stages of how sandals are made, footwears are made. And each one of the stages represents a stage of self-purification for him. And his Ankita signature here, Rama Rama, is called Nijatma Rama Rama. In the Siddha tradition, God is not outside the seeker. He is within the seeker. Nijatma Rama, he is the self of one's own being and the source of all joy. And again, he very powerfully sums up the Kayika philosophy. He says, do not be enslaved. You are using all these instruments of labor, the hand-awl, the blade, peg, but don't be enslaved by them. Realize that you are the maker, you are the self of the self, Nijatma Rama Rama. And so through the practice of labor, the Sharana becomes one with the divinity. A similar note is struck by next translation of Vachana I'm going to read. This is by Dasimaya, the weaver. He's here describing the technique of weaving, different stages of weaving. After tightening the warp, after arranging the golden border, after pushing the pedal down with the feet so that the frame moves up and down, the shuttle's point eats up the skein. Who waves the sari? Who weaves the sari? You or me, or Ramanatha. So, through the process of labor, Kayaka, Dasimaya here becomes one with Shiva. Who is making this sari? Shiva or me? The answer is quite obvious. Sometimes, when there is a conflict that arises between bhakti and labor, in the vachanas composed by artisan poets, they vote in favor of labor, not devotion. And there's another poem by another cobbler poet, Dhulaya, the cobbler, and which is one of my favorite poems. It's a very unusual, but it's a kind of anti-bhakti poem, I would call it. Here, the poet is making a pair of sandals, and Shiva appears from the point of his, the needle, chisel, the point of the chisel, and he tells Shiva, "Get lost. You have no place here." So, Uriya Manayalli Pratyakshnaada Parameshwarana Kandu, on seeing the great Godhead appear on the edge of the chisel, piercing the hide. Then he asks, "Ittaleke bandiraya? Why are you here, sir? In front of the one that moves about carrying the bag of flesh. Vadala tittiya hotaruvavana munde. Go away to the dwelling places of your devotees. Ninna bhaktara pathalinge hogo. Ninna belliya pettakke hogo. Go back to your silver mountains. Ninna bhaktara nine kai. Go and protect your devotees. But for me, Namage, Namma, Kama, Dhuma, Dhureshwarana Saku is Ankita as the Lord of lust, dust, and smoke, whom he realizes through his act of labor. So even God, Shiva, has no place when he is performing his labor, because labor is superior to Shiva, according to Dhulaya, the cobbler. And I just have 10 minutes, so let me read a couple of other poems. This is one of the Vachanakaras was a burglar, Maritande, the burglar, Kannada Maritande. And see, this burglary was one of the professions condemned in those days. But he has, even this act of burglary, he sees as a paradigm of spiritual experience. He says, "For the master of the picklock, I slaughtered a goat." Picklock is the instrument through which he burgles houses. "Sacrificed a monkey. Dedicated my parents. If in spite of all this, the stolen object does not come to me lovingly, I declared, Lord of Mara, the love God, the foe of Mara does not exist." So I do my labor of burgling honestly, and I have sacrificed a goat and a monkey. Monkey is the mind, goat is the body. Dedicated my parents. I have given up my biological origins for all this. If in spite of that, the God, the love God, here he calls Shiva Mareshwara. It's not the enemy of Manmata, but the Lord of Manmata. If he doesn't come to me, I know on his own, I deny his existence. Elsewhere, with a touch of humor, he describes his burgling at night. "If I am a thief at night, that would be a shame to the master who gave me the picklock. If I enter houses when people are forgetful, that would be a shame to my art. I wake up the forgetful, show them their riches, and then bring out my own too, O Father, Lord of Mara, love God, the foe of love God. So he says, I don't cheat people. I don't steal when they're sleeping. I steal from them when they're fully awake. Because if I steal that way, that will be a shame to my art of stealing. So this is how I don't steal the riches, take the riches away from them. I show them their own riches. This is how he transforms even the act of burglary into a kind of spiritual experience, as a spiritual praxis. I have just time for one more vachana. I said not all of them were artisans. There was another great vachana poet called Turugahi Ramanna, Ramanna, the cowherd. I'm not sure whether all these Kayaka Vachanakaras were contemporaries of Basavanna, because many of them don't even mention the name of Basavanna. Maybe when this whole narration of Virashaivism was constructed during the Vijayanagara period, in the Sangopani Yuga, the age of consolidation, all of them were made to appear contemporaries of Basavanna, because most of the names goes into Shuddha Sampadane. They have conversation with Basava and Allama. But Shuddha Sampadane is a purely dramatic anthology. I don't think it has any historical, though it's an intensely creative anthology. I contest its historical authenticity. So here is Turgai Ramanna. The act of cowherding for him becomes equivalent of the Pancha Mahakaryas, the 5 great deeds of Paramashiva, which is talked about in Alamas. Creation, protection, destruction, disappearance, and grace. Srishti, Palana, Laya, Tirodhana, and Anugraha. In Tamil text is called Paraittal, Kattal, Arittal, Marittal, Arul. These are the 5 functions of Paramashiva. So by just the sheer act of herding cows, he says, is participating in these cosmic functions. He is performing the functions of the 3 great divinities, the creator, the protector, and destructor, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra. He says, at dawn, I keep vigil of Rudra. Astamanalli Rudra Nakari. At noon, I keep vigil of Vishnu. Madhyanadalli Vishnu Vakari. At sunset, I keep vigil of At dawn, I keep vigil of Brahma. At noon, I keep vigil of Vishnu. At sunset, I keep vigil of Rudra. At night, after I drive the herd back to the folds, oh, when shall I be rid of this cowherd staff? No, the cowherd staff shall not drop from my hands until Vishweshwara Linga, the Lord of cowherd, ceases to be. So the ultimate purpose of Kayaka as a sadhana, you can call it Bhakti or differently, is to deconstruct God himself. So until this concept of God, Allama also talks about the death of God. That's why Manodeva calls entitles his translation of Vachanas published recently, God is dead, there's no God. Because Allama talks about, he deconstructs God himself in many of his vachanas. In one of his vachanas, he talks about Ganga Devi, talking about Shiva. Ganga Devi is widowed. Gauri Devi, and his other spouse, Gauri, removed her earrings because widows, when the husbands died, they removed their earrings. Vasudeva Vibhana Hutta. Vasudeva carried the fire. Vayudeva Kulya Nikida. Wind God set the fire ablaze. Attidatta Gogeshwara Satyanda Suddhi. From then on spread the news that Gogeshwara is dead. So Kayaka approach to spiritual praxis. It approaches divinity, experiences divinity, ultimately it dissolves divinity. So what is exemplified in these, for paucity of time, I've not been able to give more examples, and if need be, I'll talk about them in my responses to your questions. So what it does is to not only go through the process of bhakti, traverse the path of bhakti, but ultimately it transcends bhakti into what the agamas, Shaiva agamas in particular, call Shiva Vyapatattva, Paramashiva, which has different names in different other constitutions, like Bhuta Tatata in Zen Buddhism, and so on and so forth. So I stop here. Because there were many things I could clarify in the process of my presentation, but I'll do my best to shed more light on them should there be any questions. Thank you, Professor Shiva.
Thank you, Professor Shivaprakash, for that comprehensive journey of this entire Sharana tradition that you have taken. I would open the floor for questions now. If the participants have any specific question to Shivaprakash, Professor Shivaprakash, please raise your hand. We'll take it accordingly. You could post your questions or comments as well. Meanwhile, as the participants have questions, Professor, just listening to the last part, I was just wondering the Kayaka approach to divinity, the whole idea of it completely absorbing and absolving the very idea of God, what you have brought in. I was wondering this whole notion of mysticism around the Bhakti tradition, and for some reason, Sharana tradition seems to be very objective and to the extent of being very rationalist as well in many cases. So how do you account for this contradiction of being rationalist at the same time being mystical in its nature?
The word mystical, I deliberately did not use, and I've been avoiding this word in my discussion of these topics, because the word mysticism is very misleading. It's a combination of mist and schism. I don't want to go to that. But is there a word for this spiritual domain that we're talking about through bhakti, yoga, tantra, etc., etc.? I don't find any single word in the pan-Indian context. Some people call it Brahma Vidya, but it doesn't apply to all domains of spirituality. Siddha, Mata, Siddha, etc., etc., different nomenclatures. But luckily for us in Kannada, we have a specific term to suggest the mystical phenomenon that we're talking about. Is called Anubhava. So in Vachanas, you have the combination of Bhakti and Anubhava. Anubhava is the extension of what I call Siddha Marga. Self-purification and self-examination, okay? So Anubhava has a different meaning in Sanskrit poetics, in Natya Shastra aesthetics, Vibhava Anuva Sanjari, Samyoga Rasanishpati. That's a different context. Anubhava means the knowledge which comes from empathizing of Tanmayi Bhava. That knowledge is called Anubhava. So you become the same as what you commune with. So Anubhava is the word used by Sharanas. So the path of Anubhava is very empirical, down to earth, so it has to be rational. Whereas Bhakti need not be. Whereas Basavana has this kind of contradiction. He talks about people of other faiths. He comes down hard, he's very rational. For example, he talks about people who worship Shivalingam in the temple, and when the Jangama come, they don't give him alms, and people who worship snake stones, when the real snake appears, they go and kill them, etc., etc. But he himself says if somebody is wearing a Shivalingam, and has toddy in one hand and meat in the other hand, I bow down to him because he's a bhakta. So this unconditional bhakti is there at the same time. This critical rationality is there in all the bhaktas. When it comes to their own beliefs, they're very, they stand by them, they defend them endlessly. When they criticize others, they can be very harsh. Whereas Anubhavis don't do that. They are much more objective. And they're not interested in pulling down anybody. They're interested in experiencing and expressing their own communion with the divine.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I think I saw Anchit Jain raising his hand. There is a question, and there are some questions in the chat box as well. But I think I'll first go to Anchit. Anchit, if you could ask the question to Professor. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, sir, thank you so much for this beautiful lecture, and we had a great anubhav of this lecture. Sir, I have two questions which are quite related. First is, I really like your point that labor is superior to Shiva. So my question is regarding that how can we understand the spiritual underlying of labor that was explained by Vachanakar? That is, how the physical act of labor turns into a spiritual labor. Now, sir, my second question is, sir, I have been studying Swaminarayan Bhakti tradition of Gujarat. So even in this tradition, any kind of labor or any kind of actions, if done for the pleasure of the divine or for the devotion of the Lord, is treated as bhakti. So even if one clears one toilets or milks his cow or carries business with the happiness of Lord, then it is treated as same as bhakti. So at gross level, they consider that there is a difference between physical labor and bhakti, but at a certain level, at Sukshma level, both become same. So in the Swaminarayan Bhakti praxis, there is no distinction between labor and bhakti. So is this kind of a distinction or lack of distinction is there in Vachanas?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. Let me answer the second question first. The kayaka that Sharnas are talking about, and different acts of labor practiced as part of seva in other Bhakti traditions, like Swaminarayan tradition that you mentioned, are the same or different? Obviously, they're different. Because here, you're doing this labor to please others, to please God, as part of your duty to society or to the sect you're working with. In Kayaka, there's no such accountability to anybody except to one's own self. So labor, to bring in a concept from Karl Marx, what Kayaka poets are talking about is unalienated labor. Labor becomes the expression of the worker. It's not a denial. Whereas when you do it as seva, you're denying yourself and to serve others. That's another spiritual orientation. I'm not condemning it, but what is described in what is expressed, not described in the Vachanas, this Anubhavis is it is for themselves. Is for themselves, and they're not apart from the divinity, where the seeker and the sought are one through the act of labor. As the seeker and the sought become one in the tantric union in a different ritualistic context.
And this is how they explain the spiritual underlaying of that labor.
Spiritual?
Underlaying of their labor, that how this is how their physical act turns into a spiritual labor.
No, it's not spiritual labor. Labor itself is spiritual. It's not spiritualizing labor, attaining spirituality through labor. Labor is upaya, it is sadhana marga, it is soteriology for them. So that's a different approach.
Okay.
There's Bhagavad Gita talks about karma yoga. And why does when do Sharanas never use the word karma, they use the word kayaka? Because karma is the duty enjoined to you depending on your caste, and again, karma is part of this baggage of dana, dharma, etc. And particularly the philosophy of Kaika is also related to the philosophy of Dasoha, because Sharanas reject dana and dharma, because dana and dharma, charity, is given by people who have a surplus value which they have extracted from others. And the Vachana poets call it Parasati Paradhana. So who are the biggest givers, the biggest kings? And what is their achievement? They have looted to the maximum other people's wealth and women. So they reject this whole institution of dana, and they believe in this dasoha through one's own honest labor. The bhakta makes an offering to a jangama, a mendicant guru. So the philosophy of kayaka and dasoha are interconnected. Because of the positive time, I could go into that dimension of kayaka philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. There is one more question here from Billy. There are two questions, in fact. I'll split that into two. So the first one is, what is the reason for change in your stand that Sharana movement was not anti-caste? I slightly would like to add my own views before I pose this question. Also, the general argument that Vachana, Sharana poetry is anti-establishment, and you seem to have taken a stand that it is not really so. We would like to hear about your views on that, Professor. Yeah.
Yeah, I have reached my present inference after some 30 years of looking into these matters. In my heady Marxist days, I thought that Vachana, revolution, and I read this book, Shouten's book, Revolution of Mystics, and so on. My blood started boiling. I wrote my play Mahachaitra. Trying to express that kind of understanding of Vachanas. But over years, the more I delve into the Vachana text, and the more I look at the Vachanas in relation to other, Bhakti traditions in India, the more I see that Bhakti and Siddha traditions are neither for or against the system. They're trying to transform the system from within. For example, in the Siddha, in fact, our spiritual tradition, not the written tradition perhaps, but the oral tradition of Avadhutas, talks about two kinds of paramparas. One is Bindu Parampara, biological lineage, the father and son. The other is Nada Parampara, spiritual lineage, Guru Shishya Parampara. So all Bhakti and Siddha tradition belong to this Nada Santana, the spiritual lineage, where the bond between the spiritual father and the disciple happens through Diksha, particularly initiation into mantra or a yogic tantric practice. So this is one. All of them belong to that. Whereas Acharya Parampara is part of the establishment of society which was based on certain kind of varnashrama and so on and so forth. So these are two distinct traditions. So if you look at the phenomenon from this viewpoint, Bhaktis and Siddha traditions were neither anti-caste movements nor were they apologies for caste exploitation. This is my present position.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Now there is one more question again by Dilip. He says, if we are writing Mahachaitra today, how different it would be?
I don't think of writing Mahachaitra again now, because I had enough trouble from fundamentalist Lingayas after writing this. I don't want to lock heads, horns with them anymore. I have grown wiser.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, yes, Professor. If there are one more hand, there is. I'll just go to that. Who's that? Yeah, Abhishek Tripathi has a question. Yeah, Abhishek, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor. Sir, my question is on, Siddha tradition, and within this Siddha tradition, because I have worked little bit on Hatha Yoga and this tradition. So I was thinking, when you said this, beautifully explained this difference in some way about Vachanas and Bhakti. I was thinking, let's say I take the example of Gorakhnath. So first he wrote lot of things and practiced things on Siddha tradition. We know the textual tradition of what he has written. And then, as you also talks about Gorakhvani, which we are very popular in Eastern UP, where I come from. So I was thinking, is it the approach taken by the philosopher or the institutions of the Siddhas, taking it to the masses for more acceptance of what they were doing maybe in Privi, because you know that Hatha Yoga has also amalgamation with Tantra tradition and all. So rather simplifying them for the masses, I could see like it's coming from them and then taking out. It's a concentrated effort towards taking it to the masses.
Okay. I don't think that Siddhas were popularizers of spirituality. Okay, they were serious practitioners, and they were initiating serious practitioners. And when it comes to Gorakhnath, is Gorakhnath a historical figure? There seem to be several Gorakhnaths. Gorakhnath has become a mythical figure, is a kind of paradigmatic character, not an individual. And I'm aware there are many narrative poems in Bengali and Gujarati about the life of Gorakhnath and how Gorakhnath was imprisoned by in an island of enchanting women, and he loses his self-knowledge, and his disciple Matsyendra goes and releases him, and so on. And Gorakhvani, which I've read, happens to be a later medieval period text, where many of the teachings of Siddha tradition was compiled. So the teachings of Siddhas, Natha Siddhas, were disseminated through oral transmission. And there are some texts like Siddha Siddhanta Kaumidi attributed to Gorakhnath, or for example, you have this Shiva Samhita, Ghiran Samhita, etc. They are summing up the manual, summing up different dimensions of these practices. Okay, it's a different thing. But if you look at Siddha Natha tradition, and let me cut out all verbiage and call them tantric traditions. Okay. Now, what is happening in Tantra? If we look at the evolution of Tantra, we find that it moves from the most exoteric type of spirituality to the most esoteric, interiorized kind of spirituality. For example, if you look at Kashmir Shaivism, there are three, it's called Trika Shastra, three basic traditions. One is this Kaula, which believes in external practices, Tantric, Vamachar Tantra, etc. And then there is this Spanda Marga, which is more intro-meditative. And then Pratyabhigna, which is more contemplative. So all spirituality, when it deepens, it moves towards greater and greater interiorization. That's happened in the Tantric tradition also. So that's when the philosophy moves from Advaita to Dvaita to Advaita. Whereas in Bhakti, as it was outlined by Utpalacharya, it is Advaitic right from the start. Because the moment you utter the name of Shiva, you become one with Shiva. No different from him. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, we have one more question, Dr. Neeta. Yeah, Dr. Neeta, please go ahead.
If there are any questions from participants, maybe they can. If not, I'll go. Is there any other question? See?
Hello.
Yeah.
This is not a question. I just, Selvamani, I just want to say, how lovely it was and how you have opened up several, I think, research doors to be explored further. Particularly, I loved what you said about this burglar Sharana. Quite interesting and very unique. Of course, we do have not something like exactly like this, but then the devotees take real liberties with God, of course, in Tamil Bhakti also. But this, I think, is by far the kind of greatest form of that kind of an expression of relationship between human and God. So it's wonderful. And I'm sorry, I really don't know much about this Tamil Bhakti tradition enough to really dialogue with you, but it's a great opportunity to learn so much about these traditions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Solomoni. Thank you very much.
Dr. Neeta, you may go ahead with your questions.
Yeah, thank you. So this question is basically, it's not, I as coming from Harvard, I generally woke up listening to music and particularly many of these vachanas. ನಾನು ಬೆಳಿಗ್ಗೆ ಏಳೋದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ರೇಡಿಯೋ ಆಕಾಶವಾಣಿ ಧಾರವಾಡ ಜನರಲಿ ಪೇಡ್ ಒಲೆ ಹತ್ತಿ ಊದಿರದೆ ನಿಲ್ಲಬಹುದಲ್ಲದೆ ಧಾರೆ ಹತ್ತಿ ಊದಿರದೆ ನಿಲ್ಲಬಹುದು. ಕೆಲವು ನುಡಿದರೆ ಮುತ್ತಿನ ಹಾರದಂತಿರಬೇಕು, ಅಕ್ಕ ಕೇಳವ, ಈ ತರ ಕೆಲವು ಜನರಲಿ ಐ ಗ್ರೂ ಅಪ್ ಲಿಸ್ನಿಂಗ್ ಟು vachanas through classical music, particularly Hindustani classical music. ಅದನ್ನ ಈಗ ವಿಚಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಗೇಯತೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅದರ ಸಂಗೀತದೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಸಂಬಂಧ ಇತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ 12ನೇ ಶತಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ, ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಕಂಡಂಗೆ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಆಲ್ ದಿಸ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ವೆರಿ ರೀಸೆಂಟ್. ಐ ಮೀನ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ್ ಮನ್ಸೂರ್, ಪಂಡಿತ್ ಬಸವರಾಜ್ ರಾಜ್ಗುರು, ಪಂಡಿತ್ ಮನ್ಸೂರ್. Only then some of these people, they have brought it to the classical stage. Classical stage, and also we unfortunately we also see it exiting because I don't see anybody other than Pandit Venkatesh Kumar performing them on the classical stage. So what is this relation between music and vachanas? Adara geyate bagge and ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಏನಾದ್ರು if you can show it.
Bhakti is easier to express through song and dance. Even vachanas, though apparently they are prose compositions, they lend themselves to singing. And the vachanakaras themselves never tell us that they were writing down vachanas. Aaduvenu, aaduvenu, nalidaduvenu. They would sing and dance and celebrate their songs. So music and dance are the inevitable concomitants of spiritual joy. And the compositions of vachanas, vachanakaras, though they're called vachanas, and they're also a set of compositions which are in the form of songs. And they were put together into an anthology called Shivadasa Geetanjali, which was edited by Dr. L. Basuraj, a great Vachana scholar. And this led to a lot of controversy because they said that Dasa is a Vaishnava specific term. How to use it in the context of Shaivism? But it's true that there are a lot of compositions which are singable vachanas. There is a term in the tradition for this. It's called Swara Vachana. Because after the 12th century fluorescence was over, a lot of saints, poets from particularly North Karnataka, composed compositions called Swaravachanas. They are also called Tattvapadas. Swaravachanas are vachanas which can be rendered into a song. But even the classical vachana can also be rendered into the song. In the early 20th century, of course, when vachana texts were being recovered by leading Virashaiva scholars like Harakatti and others, that was the time the Lingayat community evoked its importance, and some of the greatest musical virtuosos of North Karnataka started singing them in the classical form. Of course, there was Mallikarjun Mansoor, Basura Rajguru. Another great singer who was forgotten was no less than them, the Sidram Jambaldini from Raichur. And then even now we have Venkatesh Kumar and we have Smita Dellu from Mumbai. She also sings very well. And there are several others who are still doing it. So, and some people have tried to sing vachanas in Carnatic music. There was one great exponent of Carnatic music called Devendrappa. He used to sing vachanas in Carnatic music. But I think because Hindustani music lends itself more easily to elaboration of emotions, it's easier to sing vachanas through Hindustani music than through Carnatic music. So this experiment, not many people experimenting with singing of vachanas. I think it should go on. So the musical rendering of vachanas can itself be a subject of study.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I think we have one more question. Srinivas Acharya, I think, Professor. Srini, you may please go ahead.
It's not exactly to do with art, labor, and ethics of Vachana tradition that I have a question. Is it's about ontology of it's related to the ontology of Bhakti Siddha tradition. There are a couple of questions, but I will ask one by one. Is primary question is about the idea of mukti in Veerashaiva Lingayata tradition. Particularly, so in the Vedanta schools that they have tried to maintain when it comes to mukti, is most of these Vedanta traditions, they believe in the idea called Parabrahman, which is different from the Chaturmukha Brahma. So there is something called Supreme Being, Parabrahman, and there has been either the unity has been proposed that once through the bhakti that they get liberated, and what is that liberation is becoming the Brahman itself is one of the ideas. And there has been others that they still maintain the distinction from the Brahman and still be devoted. This is Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita. Both of them, even in mukti, that they after the liberation also, they are distinct from the Brahman, and for them Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita, that is Ramanuja and Madhva Parampara, for them that Brahman is Vishnu, so they maintain the distinction from the Vishnu, but still they are the devotees, the bhaktas. And similarly, Swaminarayan Sampradaya, that is the Akshardham Sampradaya, also they maintain that the distinction is there, and they continue to be the bhakti, the Sevya Sevaka Bhava is retained in the mukti status. Now, in case of particularly Veerashaiva Advaita tradition, also one interesting thing that I would like to say particularly is that Shrikanta Acharya or Shrikanta Acharya of 11th century and Shripati Acharya of 14th century, they said they have commented, it is said that they have commented on Brahma Sutra from Veerashaiva and Shiva Vishishtadvaita, Shivadvaita perspective.
Shakti Vishishtadvaita.
So now, given these two Vedanta commentaries and given the Bhakti tradition of the Veerashaiva Lingayat Vachana and other Bhakti movements, now what is the ontological status of the, even given taking the Pashupatagama and so on, what is the ontological status of the Jiva who worships Shiva through Bhakti? What, once they are liberated, what would they become? Do they continue to retain the Sevya Sevaka Bhava in the Mukti, like in Vishishtadvaita or Dvaita or Swaminarayan Sampradaya or Chaitanya Sampradaya and so on? Or they become Shiva and there is no Sevya Sevaka Bhava and so on?
I'd like to answer your question with a verse from Shiva Stotravali by Utpala Deva. Aparimita Rupamaham Tam Tam Bhavam Pratikshanam Pashyan Tvameva Vishwarupam Nijanatham Sadhu Pashyayam. So Bhakta becomes Shiva, Shiva becomes everything. He has the experience of Vishwarupa. Bhaktas are talking about the experience. They're not talking about the theory of this experience. So, Bhakti, according to me, moves from sometimes the emphasis on Dvaita, but sometimes it's on Advaita. Ultimately, I think, as Ramakrishna Paramahamsa said, this Dvaita, Advaita, they're the different stages of human consciousness. And Abhinavagupta, in one of his hymns, Ambastava, he says, some people say that you can be attained through Dvaita, some people through Dvaita, some people through Advaita, but you're beyond all these positions. So Bhakti gives us expresses that experience, whereas theologies like commentaries in Brahma Sutra try to analyze this experience. So the purposes are totally different. So because I am not an authority in Vedanta or Brahma Sutras, this is all I can say in reply to your response to your question.
One more, this is little social question. Thank you for the response of that. But one more I have is a little social question, is that this is directly related to Veerashaiva Sampradaya, Lingayat Sampradaya, is the point as we understand in the 11th century when Basavanna, 11th and 12th century when Basavanna initiated the Lingayat movement, particularly is to say that there is no, the Vedic caste system and all is detrimental to the society, and it is discriminative in nature. So in Shiva's creation, all are one. So there is no distinction of the social barriers and so on. So, but yet this Stavara and Jangama distinction, that in one sense it still takes that the hegemonic role is what is perceived. So do you have a different take on this, or how do you perceive this?
Okay. You think that Lingayat Veerashaiva tradition is something well defined that is unified. It's not. I have deconstructed this unity of Lingayat Veerashaiva thing. I call it Sharana path, and shown three distinct approaches within that. Of course, Sthavara and Jangama philosophy is talked about in some of the Vachanas by Basavanna, and this binary understanding was exaggerated by scholars like E.K. Ramanujan. Sthavara is something that has to be worthy of condemnation, and Jangama is something that has to be celebrated, and so on. But there's one Vachana by Basavanna where he says, less known Vachana by Basavanna, unless the Sthavara becomes Jangama and Jangama becomes Sthavara, you can't attain the divine. So he dissolves this dualism between Sthavara and Jangama. It's true. When the community of Sharanas later evolved into a caste, okay, which was a kind of system of various subcastes, by about, say, 19th century. Schouten has these details in his book. The fathers of Sharanas, they developed into a caste with a hierarchy of subcastes and so on. And that's when, the initiation of untouchable and backward communities completely stopped. So the Lingaitism itself developed many Sthavaras. Like Ishtalinga became a Sthavara. Though not all Vachana poets talk about the need for Ishtalinga, I've given you some examples. They thought this was the quintessence of Lingaitism. This is very important. And then all these acharas, practices like Ashtavarana, etc., etc. These are superficial matters. So that's why when there was another kind of spiritual response to the Sharana culture later in the parts of later 300 years later, which was pioneered by Kodekala Basaveshwara, he rejected the Shivalingam, Ishtalingam. He accepted only Bhavalinga and Pranalinga, rejected Ishtalinga. So it evolved further into the philosophy and practice of Kodekala Basaveshwara. And we don't see the 12th century so-called Shaivism in relation to later developments. I would like to see it dynamically, dialectically, in relation to its later developments. And I refuse to believe that present day Virashaiva history, mythology, etc. The Virashaivas are with the specific history and mythology, etc. They are the sole custodians of this Sharana heritage. Because you look at the community of Sharana, they came from all castes. It is the heritage of all the castes and communities of Karnataka, irrespective of gender.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Srini, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for elaborating specifically with your specific insights into these aspects. Because of the paucity of time, we would not able to take more questions now. So I would conclude the session with this. Thank you, Professor, once again for this wonderful session from our end. Thank you very much.